Why would a philosopher write a book about the history of madness? And how could that be the beginning of a larger investigation into the relationship between power and knowledge? Michel Foucault observed that Western civilization has always been familiar with madness. Madness has always had a place in society, and since Greek Antiquity, madness has appeared in various literature, poetry, and plays. However, starting in the 17th century, mad people were separated from society, and it wasn't until the 19th century that madness began to be studied and understood from a scientific perspective. So what changed? What led society to view madness in a new light? Foucault noticed a recurring pattern in how Western society deals with deviant or marginal topics, such as homosexuality, madness, delinquency, and foreign cultures. So he argues that before society tries to understand anything it sees as a deviation, it first has to isolate it and reject it. And by excluding these groups, society can first control them and then begin to understand them. This process of exclusion isn't intentional. It's an unconscious pattern that has repeatedly happened with all groups that deviated from the dominant social norms. So this exclusion, along with the power that enforces it, will shape and control how society eventually understands these groups. This idea raised fundamental questions for Foucault. Is our knowledge of madness or any deviation shaped by the power that isolates it? Do we only begin to understand something after we've controlled it? These questions led Foucault to define a central project early in his philosophical career, to critique the institutions of rationality. These are institutions like governments, schools, hospitals, and prisons that structure, organize, and control society. To better understand Foucault's project, we will examine his first book, Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason. This was Foucault's doctoral thesis and was published 3 years later as his first book in 1964. In this book, Foucault doesn't define madness from a scientific perspective. Instead, he takes a historical approach, tracing how the meaning of madness evolved from the Middle Ages to the 19th century. This project is what Foucault called the archaeology of knowledge, which was inspired from Nietzsche's genealogy of morals. So the question of what is madness becomes how has madness been perceived throughout this time, and what does this evolution reveal not only about mad people, but also about ourselves and our society. In the Middle Ages, mad people were fully integrated into society. They lived peacefully alongside others and weren't viewed as a threat. However, this neutral stance changed during the Renaissance. The fear of the plague, which caused significant damage in Europe, transformed into a fear of madness. For the first time, madness was viewed as a threat to humanity. It was suddenly seen as something that could spread like a disease and provoke generalized insanity. This sudden focus on madness can be seen in the publication of The Ship of Fools in 1494 by Sebastian Brandt, a German humanist and theologian. It was the first famous critique of madness and societal vices. The book depicts the idea of a boat filled with people considered insane or morally corrupt, drifting aimlessly in the open sea. This idea symbolizes madness, irrationality, and moral disorder as separate from society. The Ship of Fools represents an attempt to deal with madness by physically isolating mad people. By doing so, society avoided the responsibility of understanding or integrating them. Just to clarify, this idea was a myth and was never actually carried out. It's more of a symbolic representation of society's approach to deal with madness rather than a historical practice. However, the real isolation started in the classical age. During that time, reason thrived under the influence of René Descartes in the 17th century, leading to a fixation on madness. Until then, the fear of madness wasn't widespread and was mostly ignored. An important action to address this fear happened during the reign of the King Louis XVI. The creation of the Hôpital Général by decree. According to Foucault, people saw this decree as simply an administrative reform and didn't understand its full impact. On the surface, it was simply a matter of grouping together certain hospitals in Paris into a single entity. However, the project had a hidden agenda and a more serious objective. Foucault says, from the very start, one thing is clear. The Hôpital Général is not a medical establishment. It is rather a sort of semi-judicial structure, an administrative entity which, along with the already constituted powers and outside of the courts, decides, judges, and executes. He continues by describing it as a quasi-absolute sovereignty, jurisdiction without appeal, a writ of execution against which nothing can prevail. The Hôpital Général Général is a strange power that the king establishes between the police and the courts, at the limits of the law, a third order of repression. The true goal of the Hôpital Général wasn't to improve care or medical treatment. It was to control people considered socially undesirable or deviant. And by creating a common place for all these deviant groups, it became much easier to control them and isolate them. And this is why Foucault referred to this period in the 17th century as le grand internement, which means the great confinement in English, because this marked a turning point in how society in Europe dealt with madness, not because of the act of isolation itself, but rather because it was carried out in a systematic and organized way. Mad people went from being members of society to being treated like criminals, because the real objective of the Hôpital Général wasn't only to isolate mad people, but also to punish any form of social deviation from the dominant norms. So this included beggars, prostitutes, homeless people, idlers, blasphemers, and also truly insane people. Foucault explains that all these groups were placed together in the same category, with no intention to define them or separate them. Together, they formed a homogeneous world of mental alienation. In this time, the madman wasn't seen as a victim of mental illness, but as someone who failed to use his reason correctly. In other words, someone guilty of his actions. He was seen as persisting or choosing to always behave in a way that goes against society's, the state's, and religion's expectations. In this view, what happens to someone society considers guilty? They are severely punished to correct their behavior and make them feel guilty. This was seen as the only way to restore their reason, as therapeutic methods didn't exist at the time. There was no effort to treat an illness or even to identify it. Instead, the goal was to correct deviant behavior through violence, humiliation, and terror. All the confined people were grouped together as insane and treated the same way. They were often whipped, branded on the shoulder, and isolated. Simply put, the General Hospital was mainly a prison in disguise. It was a place where cruelty and despair ruled, not where illnesses were treated or care was given. So apart from isolating and punishing these groups, what were the other objectives fulfilled by the General Hospital? The solution was to put them to work, and there were two main reasons for this. First, because these groups were often idle, and the state saw this as a disruption to the social order, especially during a time of crisis across Europe. The state saw madness as a social problem. People who weren't working or contributing to society were seen as a threat to the stability and productivity of the community. So by confining them and making them work, the state felt they were addressing both a moral issue and an economic one. They were correcting a deviant behavior, but also increasing the productivity of the community. So confined people were used as a cheap and docile labor to help the economy. They were sent to work on building sites and given hard tasks, since they couldn't really say no. Also, work was seen as an antidote to madness. People believed that work kept the mind healthy and gave life meaning and purpose. So putting excluded groups to work was thought to protect them from going mad. However, society's view of madness wasn't only about economic utility or exclusion. The classical age was the beginning of an emphasis on rational thought, social hierarchy, and moral order. This emphasis clearly divided reason on the one hand and unreason on the other. Madness then clearly belonged to unreason and thus should be fought against in every possible way. This is why confinement places mainly appeared when reason became dominant. The practice of confinement wasn't really about madness itself. It was about a society that rejected it and refused to tolerate it. This created a clear black and white division between reason and madness. One side represented what was considered normal, while the other was considered abnormal. One side represented social order, moral codes, and institutions of power, and the other represented everyone who doesn't conform to the social norms imposed by society. Paradoxically, one might think that the age of reason was about understanding and including all the different members of society, yet it ended up doing the exact opposite. For Foucault, this shows that reason in the classical age was not an opening to scientific knowledge as we might think, but was rather a movement of exclusion. It consisted precisely of excluding and prescribing without understanding, as if insanity suddenly represented everything wrong with society. It was suddenly portrayed as the absolute evil. As we said in the introduction, it was only after this phase of exclusion that Western society began to see madness as a mental illness that could be treated. Reason initially expressed itself through rejection, confinement, and violence. In other words, for madness to become an object of knowledge, it first had to be demonized and rejected. This period of exclusion during the classical age is what Foucault called the secret foundation of our modern experience of madness. But what does this mean exactly? Our modern approach to madness is still rooted in the same reflex to exclude and punish mad people. We can see this theme with the fact that psychiatry used to treat mad people with violence by using electroshocks among other harsh methods. Although this exclusion in the 17th century sense no longer happens, we still have the reflex to view madness as a deviation instead of a mental illness. The mad isn't viewed as a patient, but rather as a deviant person. We're using the same framework established in the 17th century, the same dividing narrative between reason and madness. Anyone who deviates from the social norm, and therefore from reason, is considered to be mad and is excluded from society. This reflects a cultural conditioning, and that's why Foucault calls them secret foundations. They are deeply embedded and ingrained in collective consciousness that we usually don't question them. We think that this is how we've always treated mad people, and it's simply the way things are. In fact, these ideas about madness don't stem from a scientific or universal truth. They were formed at specific times in history, influenced by culture and social narratives, rather than being the only way to understand madness. So the way we view and treat madness today could have been very different if history had taken a different path. So if our view on madness isn't a universal or objective truth, why hasn't it changed to this day, especially with all the scientific advancements? The answer is simple, because behind this view of madness lies an attempt to seize and maintain power. In other words, this view of madness gives power to the doctor. As we've mentioned, the General Hospital was originally a place to confine and exclude people society considered mad. However, during the French Revolution, a doctor named Philippe Pinel brought major changes to this practice. Pinel visited the hospital and was shocked by the inhumane way mad people were treated. So with the government's agreement, Pinel ended the practice of locking up mad people. In Foucault's words, he freed the insane. Pinel also realized there was a difference between people society called mad and those who were truly mentally ill. This understanding helped create the idea of mental illness and marked the beginning of psychiatry. From that point on, mentally ill people were seen as human beings suffering from a mental condition. However, this shift came with a deep contradiction. Although Pinel freed them from harsh confinement, he placed them in a new institution, the asylum, which didn't necessarily have better conditions. Here, the doctor became the central authority, and the asylum became the new place of control. In the asylum, the doctor had enormous power. Just like a judge in a court, he had the authority to decide who entered the asylum, who could leave, who was insane and who wasn't. According to Foucault, this power was given to the doctor by the medical system, not to help cure patients, but rather to correct their behavior. It was for moral reasons, not scientific ones. While the doctor wasn't there to abuse patients like the guards of the General Hospital, he wasn't there either to cure them using science. Throughout the 19th century, the doctor's main goal was to make patients accept their own madness and agree with the values of the new, powerful bourgeois society. In other words, the asylum changed, but the purpose of confinement remained the same. It was about enforcing certain moral standards. This is why Foucault argues that knowledge and power are deeply connected. The doctor's authority, symbolized by his white coat, held more importance than real medical knowledge. For the doctor, the goal wasn't to heal, but to be obeyed and to correct the patient. This created a dependency between the patient and the doctor. In the asylum, the doctor became a central figure, almost like a wise man or a guide, but also a judge who enforced specific rules. Patients were expected to follow these rules as if the doctor knew best what was good for them. This power dynamic was now stronger and more obvious, because the doctor was a visible authority figure. Patients knew exactly who they had to turn to for approval or permission. The doctor held power by claiming to have specific knowledge and by representing the medical institution. However, as Foucault explains, the doctor actually lacked true medical knowledge. But within the asylum itself, the doctor takes a preponderant place, insofar as he converts it into a medical space. However, and this is the essential point, the doctor's intervention is not made by virtue of a medical skill or a power that he possesses in himself, and that would be justified by a body of objective knowledge. It is not as a scientist that Homo medicus has authority in the asylum, but as a wise man. If the medical profession is required, it is as a juridical and moral guarantee, not in the name of science. A man of great probity, of utter virtue and scruple, who had had long experience in the asylum would do as well. Foucault explained that in the asylum, anyone could take the doctor's place, because although the doctor's power was real, his knowledge wasn't. What mattered most was the moral task, which Foucault said was the key to curing the insane. In the asylum, the goal was to appeal to the patient's sense of morality, so they could become acceptable to society again and integrate society's moral standards. The patient wasn't seen as cured until they admitted their madness and showed remorse. This was a moral trial, where doctors acted as judges. The asylum of the age of positivism, which it is Pinel's glory to have founded, is not a free realm of observation, diagnosis, and therapeutics. It is a juridical space where one is accused, judged, and condemned, and from which one is never released except by the verge of this trial in psychological depth. That is, by remorse. For Foucault, psychiatry remained ignorant about the true nature of mental illness until the end of the 20th century. It wasn't until Sigmund Freud's discoveries that mental illnesses were moved away from the asylum. They became a subject to be studied and analyzed, not condemned and excluded. But at the same time, Freud is the one who gave even more power to the doctors over their patients. Psychoanalysis gave the doctor almost divine authority, which elevated the doctor's status in the hospital. Without saying a word, the doctor can understand everything that has happened in the patient's life, from childhood trauma to current insecurities. Their gaze alone symbolized absolute control and knowledge over the patient's mind. This new status amplified the dominance of the medical figure over madness. It became a position of total control, deepening the imbalance between the patient and the doctor. Foucault's analysis of the West's view of madness reveals something very important about society. It reveals how power operates through knowledge. It shows that those who hold knowledge gain power over others regardless of the domain. This power isn't limited to psychiatric hospitals. It's present in all institutions that shape society. And this is exactly Foucault's general philosophical project. Foucault's main critique is targeted toward institutions, which are designed to impose norms and control people. When we say control people, it means controlling what they think, what they do, and how they behave. From the moment we're born, we move through different institutions like schools, universities, workplaces, and hospitals. All of them collect and store information about us, such as where we live, what we do, and what we believe. This data is used by systems of power to evaluate, monitor, and control us. Those who don't fit the dominant norms are corrected. We can say that these systems of power main objectives are to keep the masses docile and control their behavior. This is the strength of the current system. Where Jordan Peterson sees a hierarchy of competence designed to organize society, Foucault sees a hierarchy of knowledge aimed at exerting power and controlling it. The topic of madness gave us a good introduction to Foucault's thought, but I intend to make another video to better understand his views on power and knowledge. I hope you like this one. Thank you for watching.